The air at the San Giovanni military barracks was thick with heat and the smell of diesel fuel. On the dusty central parade ground, 282 soldiers stood at rigid attention, their uniforms soaked with sweat under the relentless Italian sun. They were a mosaic of young faces, some earnest, some bored, all trained to follow orders without question. At the front of this silent, olive-green formation stood Colonel Marco Rovati, a man whose reputation was carved from stone and echoed in the whispers of his men. He was a figure from another era, a believer in discipline enforced by fear, his chest a tapestry of medals earned in peacekeeping missions that had hardened rather than mellowed him. Across from him, at a respectful distance, stood Lieutenant Alessia Conti. She was a new variable in his equation of absolute control. 30 years old, with a sharp, intelligent gaze, she had recently been assigned as a logistics and communications officer. To Rovati, her presence was an irritation, a reminder of the modernizing army that seemed to value degrees over decibels, protocol over instinct. The day's inspection had begun with his usual theatrics, a hissed critique of a poorly polished boot here, a menacing pause before a recruit there. He moved down the line like a thundercloud, his voice the only sound in the still air. Then, he stopped before Lieutenant Conti. It was not her turn, nor was it her platoon. But Rovati had decided to make a point. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, his voice a low growl meant for her alone but carrying in the tense silence. "Your posture is an embarrassment, Lieutenant. You stand like a frightened schoolgirl, not an officer. This unit is being softened by paper pushers like you." Alessia did not flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, her body perfectly still. "Sir," was her only, neutral reply. This calm defiance acted like a spark on dry tinder. Something in Rovati snapped. The quiet challenge in her composure, the refusal to show fear, felt like a direct assault on his authority in front of his entire battalion. Reason evaporated, replaced by a blind, crimson rage. He forgot the 282 pairs of eyes watching. He forgot every regulation. In that moment, he saw only an insubordinate subordinate who needed to be physically put in her place. With a sudden, guttural shout that made the front rank of soldiers jerk involuntarily, Colonel Rovati dropped his swagger stick and lunged at her. His hands, large and rough, were aimed for her shoulders, intent on shaking her, on forcing her to stumble, to finally break her infuriating composure. A collective, almost imperceptible gasp seemed to suck the air from the parade ground. Time stretched and slowed. For the 282 soldiers, what happened next was not a blur, but a sequence of images etched into memory with startling clarity. Lieutenant Conti did not retreat. She did not cry out. Instead, her body moved with a fluid, economic precision that was shocking in its efficiency. As Rovati's hands came toward her, her left arm swept up in a sharp, circular motion, redirecting his momentum past her body. In the same seamless flow, her right hand shot forward, not to strike, but to control, her fingers locking around his wrist. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, her hip meeting his torso, and, using his own charging weight against him, she executed a perfect ippon suinage, a shoulder throw. But it did not end with the throw. As the colonel, a massive man, flew over her shoulder and crashed onto the hard-packed earth with a sound that made every soldier wince, Alessia maintained control of his arm. She went down with him, applying precise, inexorable pressure to the captured limb. There was a sickening, audible pop that cut through the silence, followed by the colonel's roar of pain and shock. And then, stillness. Colonel Marco Rovati lay in the dust, his uniform smeared with dirt, his right arm bent at a nauseatingly wrong angle beside him. Lieutenant Alessia Conti rose smoothly to her feet, her breathing slightly elevated, her face a mask of professional calm. She took 2 steps back and assumed a position of attention, as if waiting for the next order. The 282 soldiers stood frozen, their discipline the only thing keeping them from utter chaos. Their minds reeled. The invincible colonel, the tyrant of the barracks, had been thrown and broken by the quiet lieutenant in a move that lasted less than 5 seconds. The world they knew, where power was absolute and fear was the primary currency, had just been shattered on the sun-baked ground. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, the only movement in a scene of suspended reality. The silence that followed the colonel's impact with the ground was profound, a vacuum that swallowed sound. For a long, paralyzing moment, no one moved. The soldiers were statues, their training locking them in place even as their minds screamed. Colonel Rovati's face, pressed against the dirt, was a contorted mix of agony, disbelief, and towering humiliation. The pain from his broken arm was a white-hot fire, but it was secondary to the searing knowledge that 282 men had witnessed his downfall. He tried to push himself up with his good arm, a strangled curse escaping his lips. A young medical officer, Lieutenant Russo, broke from the ranks, his medical kit in hand. He knelt beside the colonel, his hands trembling slightly as he assessed the injury. "Don't touch me!" Rovati snarled, but the pain forced him to relent. His eyes, burning with hatred, never left Alessia. Alessia herself remained at attention, her gaze now fixed on the distant flagpole. Internally, a cold clarity had taken hold. She knew the seismic repercussions of what she had done. This was not a training mat, this was the heart of a colonel's command. She had acted on a deep-seated instinct forged over 15 years of judo, a reflex to a clear and present physical assault. But the army had its own laws, its own intricate code of honor and chain of command. The battalion's second-in-command, Major Franchi, a pragmatic man with tired eyes, finally stirred. He barked an order. "Sergeant! Assist the medical officer. The rest of you, stand fast." The spell was broken, replaced by a frantic, low-voiced activity. As Rovati was carefully helped to his feet, clutching his shattered arm, he found his voice. It was a hoarse, venomous whisper that carried. "Arrest her," he spat in the direction of Major Franchi. "You are all witnesses. Assault on a superior officer. A court-martial. She is finished." Alessia was escorted not by military police, but by two stunned senior sergeants to the barracks isolation room, a sparse cell used for holding soldiers awaiting discipline. The door clicked shut, locking her in with the enormity of her actions. Outside, the battalion was dismissed. The parade ground emptied, but a current of electric tension now crackled through the entire base. In the mess hall, barracks, and corridors, no one spoke of anything else. Whispers swirled. Some young soldiers, long victimized by Rovati's brutality, felt a secret, savage thrill. Others, more traditional, were aghast at the breach of the sacred chain of command. "She broke the colonel's arm," was repeated in disbelief. Across the base, in the infirmary, Rovati was being treated. As the medic set his arm, his mind was already weaving a narrative. Self-defense? Nonsense. It was an unprovoked, vicious attack by an unstable officer who could not handle criticism. He demanded his phone. His first call was to a general in Rome, a friend from his academy days. He painted a picture of a mutinous, violent subordinate and a moment of catastrophic loss of discipline that he, the victim, was now struggling to contain for the good of the service. The story began to solidify into an official version. Meanwhile, alone in the bare room, Alessia sat on a hard cot. She thought of her father, a carpenter who had scraped together money for her judo lessons, telling her, "Strength is for protection, piccola, never for bullying." She thought of her mother, who had warned her about the old-world mentality she would face. She replayed the lunge, the feel of his uniform in her grip, the sound of the break. She felt no triumph, only a profound fatigue and the certainty of a long fight ahead. She had no powerful allies here. Her defense would rest on the testimony of 282 soldiers conditioned to obey the very man she had humiliated. As night fell over the barracks, two distinct camps formed. The senior officers, wary of scandal and bound by loyalty to rank, closed ranks around the colonel's story. But, among the junior ranks and enlisted men, a quiet shift was occurring. The myth of Rovati's invincibility had been physically broken. The image of the calm lieutenant, who did not throw a punch but used pure technique, resonated. They had not seen a brawl, they had witnessed a precise, almost clinical application of skill against brute force. It was a distinction that would become the central battleground of the coming days. The morning after the incident, the San Giovanni barracks operated under a brittle facade of normalcy. But it was a volcano waiting to erupt. Official reports, heavily skewed by Colonel Rovati's influence from his hospital bed, had already been dispatched to regional command, framing the event as a grave and premeditated act of insubordination resulting in grievous bodily harm. Alessia was formally charged and transferred to a larger base for a preliminary hearing. Her fate seemed sealed. However, a crack had appeared in the colonel's control. The 282 witnesses were not inanimate objects, they were 282 individual consciences. The military police, tasked with collecting statements, began to notice a troubling pattern. While the soldiers, out of fear or habit, initially parroted the official line, their details were vague, evasive. "It happened very fast, sir. I didn't have a clear view." But one young private, named Davide, who had been in the front row and whose own brother had suffered under Rovati's cruelty, broke. Under gentle but persistent questioning, his story spilled out not of an unprovoked attack, but of the colonel's menacing advance, his shouted insult, and the lightning-fast reaction from Lieutenant Conti. "It was like, she had no choice, sir. He was on her," Private Davide finally said, his voice trembling but firm. His statement created a fissure. Soon, another soldier, then another, emboldened by Davide's courage, began to give more accurate accounts. A parallel, truthful narrative started to take shape on paper, contradicting the official one. News, in the age of smartphones, could not be entirely contained. While no one had dared film it, detailed descriptions leaked out from soldiers calling their families. A local journalist in a nearby town, tipped off by a soldier's anguished mother, began to dig. The story, "Colonel assaults female officer, gets arm broken in front of battalion," was too explosive to ignore. It hit regional news, then national. The army, sensitive to its public image, especially regarding the treatment of women, found itself in a public relations nightmare. Pressure mounted from Rome for a transparent investigation. Back at the main hearing base, Alessia met her appointed lawyer, Captain Giovanni Borelli, a weary-looking JAG officer who seemed to expect a quick plea deal. But, as Alessia calmly, methodically walked him through the principles of judo and the concept of kuzushi, off-balancing, explaining that her response was a trained, defensive reaction to a direct physical assault, his interest grew. He requested, and, after media pressure, was granted, a session to interview key witnesses from the battalion. Major Franchi, the second in command, was caught in the middle. His career allegiance was to the chain of command, but, as an officer, he also valued truth. Under oath, his testimony became pivotal. He confirmed the colonel's agitated state prior to the incident, his unprovoked verbal aggression towards Lieutenant Conti, and, crucially, that the colonel had initiated physical contact. He did not say it was an attack, but the implication was clear. The case was no longer a simple open and shut matter of insubordination. It was becoming a public referendum on toxic leadership, self-defense, and the changing culture of the military. Colonel Rovati, watching the news from his private clinic, saw his control slipping. The pain in his arm was now matched by a gnawing fear. The 282 soldiers he had commanded through fear were turning into 282 potential witnesses for the prosecution. His rage festered, turning inwards and outwards, plotting how to reclaim the narrative and destroy the woman who had, in his mind, destroyed him. The preliminary hearing evolved into a full court-martial, drawing the gaze of the national media and the highest echelons of the Italian Ministry of Defense. The sterile courtroom became an arena where two versions of reality clashed. The prosecution, representing the institution's instinct to protect its hierarchy, painted Alessia as a dangerously skilled individual who had overreacted to a superior's corrective criticism, using excessive force that resulted in catastrophic injury. They brought in career officers who testified to Colonel Rovati's decorated service and firm leadership style. They argued that a simple step back, a verbal protest, would have sufficed. Her judo expertise was framed not as a discipline, but as a weapon she had been waiting to use. The defense, led by the now fully engaged Captain Borelli, constructed a different case. They put the 282 soldiers at the center. One by one, a carefully selected group of them took the stand: privates, corporals, sergeants. Their testimony was not melodramatic, it was stark, simple, and consistent. They described the colonel's lunge, his hands reaching for Lieutenant Conti. They spoke of their own fear in that moment. A combat veteran sergeant, respected by all, said, "Sir, in my professional opinion, based on what I saw, Lieutenant Conti was assaulted." Her response was a defensive maneuver. On a battlefield, we are trained to neutralize a threat. She did. This was the hammer blow. The defense then called a renowned master of martial arts, a civilian professor, to the stand. Using diagrams and a voluntary demonstrator, he explained the mechanics of the ippon suinage. This is not an offensive strike, he emphasized. It is a defensive throw. Its purpose is to use an aggressor's force against them. It is initiated in response to an attack. The injury to the colonel's arm is an unfortunate but common result when a subject resists the throw or falls incorrectly, a testament to the uncontrolled nature of his lunge, not the lieutenant's intent. This expert testimony reframed the entire event. Alessia was not an aggressor, she was a reactor. The aggressor had been Colonel Rovati. The most dramatic moment came when Alessia herself took the stand. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet, firm conviction. She described her training, her father's lessons about using strength responsibly. When asked why she didn't just step aside, she replied, "In that moment, with his momentum, stepping aside might not have prevented him from grabbing me. My training took over to ensure my safety. I did not intend to break his arm. I intended to stop the attack." She looked at the panel of officers judging her. "I respect the chain of command, sirs. But, does the chain of command protect an officer from physical assault by a superior?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Outside the courtroom, public opinion had solidified in her favor. The story had become a symbol. Women's groups, veterans associations advocating for reform, and ordinary citizens saw in Alessia a stand against bullying and abuse of power. The Army's top brass, realizing the case was causing immense reputational damage, began to distance themselves from Rovati. His star was falling as quickly as it had risen. The verdict, when it came, sent a shockwave through the institution. The court-martial panel found Lieutenant Alessia Conti not guilty of assault and not guilty of insubordination. They accepted the defense's argument that she had acted in lawful self-defense. The ruling stated that an officer's rank did not grant immunity from the consequences of initiating a physical altercation, and that her response, while resulting in severe injury, was proportionate to the threat as it presented itself in that split second. For Alessia, there was no celebration, only a deep, weary relief. She was reinstated to full duty, but her career in the active army was effectively over by mutual, unspoken agreement. The notoriety was too great. 6 months later, she resigned her commission with an honorable discharge. Colonel Marco Rovati, however, faced the full scrutiny he had tried to avoid. With the verdict legitimizing the witnesses' accounts, an internal investigation was launched into his command practices. A floodgate opened. Stories of years of psychological abuse, physical intimidation, and unethical conduct poured out from past and present soldiers. He was charged with conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, and assault. He was stripped of his command, forced into early retirement, and his once proud name became synonymous with a disgraced, old guard brutality. The 282 soldiers were forever changed. They had witnessed not just a physical act, but a moral one. They had seen authority challenged by truth, and power humbled by principle. Many of them carried the lesson forward in their own careers, choosing a different style of leadership. Private Davide, the first to speak up, later attended officer candidate school. Alessia returned to civilian life. She did not seek the spotlight that was offered to her. She declined lucrative media offers and book deals. Instead, she returned to her hometown and, using her savings and a small veterans grant, opened a modest martial arts studio. She called it Il Punto di Equilibrio, the balance point. Her first students were a handful of women from the local community. Then, a few young men. Then, to her surprise, a few soldiers from nearby bases, who heard of her through the enduring grapevine, began to show up in civilian clothes. They came not to gawk, but to learn. They wanted to understand the discipline that had withstood the storm. She taught them judo not just as a sport, but as a philosophy of using minimal force, of balance, of respect, of using strength only when necessary and only to protect. One evening, a familiar face walked into the dojo, Major Franke, now a lieutenant colonel, out of uniform. He nodded to her. "I heard you were teaching the real thing, Lieutenant," he said. "I thought I might learn something." She nodded back, a faint smile touching her lips. The story of the colonel who tried to assault her and had his arm broken in front of 282 soldiers did not end with a court verdict. It ended in a quiet dojo, on mats where people learned to fall safely and rise with resilience. It ended with a lesson that rippled far beyond a dusty parade ground, that true authority is not born from fear, but from respect, and that the strongest defense is often not an attack, but impeccable balance.